At 08:11 on the morning of 25 March 1941, a 19-year-old codebreaker in a borrowed wren greatcoat sat alone in a freezing room at Bletchley Park, staring at a page of Italian cipher groups that were supposed to be unbreakable. Her name on the personnel ledger was Mavis Lever. The others in the cottage knew her as the quiet girl who never stopped scribbling patterns. On that morning she had 3 things in front of her: a blunt pencil, a stack of 5-letter groups from the Italian Navy, and a deadline that was not written anywhere but hung over every desk like fog. 3 days. In 3 days' time, a fast Royal Navy convoy would sail through the Mediterranean toward Greece, carrying fuel, ammunition, and the last illusion that Britain still controlled that sea. Italian battleships and heavy cruisers were hunting those routes. If the codebreakers stayed blind, the convoy would sail into an ambush. Somewhere out there, thousands of men were already as good as dead. They just did not know it yet. The cipher on her desk had already defeated everyone else who had touched it. Italian naval Enigma, March key, full traffic, fresh rotors, new wiring, careful operators. The official verdict from the mathematicians in the main mansion was simple: impossible for hand methods in the time available. So the slips had come to the cottage instead, to the man who ignored verdicts. Mavis's fingers were red with cold as she moved a ruler down the page. A column of 5-letter groups marched past her eyes, random, jagged, stubborn. Then something flickered in the line of nonsense. A repeated sequence, 6 letters, the same 6 letters in exactly the same order, separated by 40 characters that should have completely changed the machine's state. Her pencil stopped halfway through a stroke. Enigma was designed so that never happened. The whole point of the machine was that the same plaintext, typed twice, would encrypt differently each time. That was the guarantee that was supposed to make this traffic unassailable. Yet here, deep in a routine signal to the Italian fleet, those 6 letters appeared twice like mirrored defects in glass. It should have been impossible. Either the designers of Enigma were wrong, or the operator in Rome had done something unforgivable. Mavis levered the paper closer, heart picking up speed. The repeated group could only mean one thing. The operator had used the same padding word, the same filler, in 2 different places. The machine might be perfect, the man at the keyboard was not. If she could turn that tiny act of laziness into a window on the cipher, she might prise open the entire day's traffic. Her pencil began to move again, faster now, building chains of letters, testing alignments of rotors no one had time to test by machine. The insane idea taking shape in her mind boiled down to something any schoolgirl could understand. Treat the impossible machine like a very complicated substitution. Cipher, and trust that somewhere inside it a human being had taken a shortcut. Behind her, the cottage's cast-iron radiator ticked uselessly. Outside, cold March wind clawed at the window panes. Somewhere south, in a sea she had never seen, a battleship called Vittorio Veneto was preparing to sail with a squadron of heavy cruisers and destroyers. None of the men polishing brass on those decks knew their survival now depended on whether a young woman in Buckinghamshire could turn 6 repeated letters into a key that should not exist. But to understand how she reached that moment and how pencil marks on flimsy paper became steel and fire off Cape Matapan, it is necessary to go back. The problem had begun long before that Tuesday in March. For months the Mediterranean had been turning against Britain. Mussolini's fleet, sleek cruisers, fast destroyers, a modern battleship force had pushed into the Central Sea, threatening the fragile line of convoys that linked Egypt to Greece and Malta. Every tanker or freighter lost in those waters meant less fuel for tanks in the desert, fewer shells for the guns around Tobruk. Italian naval traffic filled the ether. Well-trained operators at Supermarina in Rome sent concise, professional orders to ships deploying from Taranto and Naples. All of it was enciphered on a specialized naval variant of Enigma. its rotors set each day according to keys known only to a handful of officers. British direction finding stations could track where the signals came from. They could plot the rough outlines of Italian operations. But the content, the order of battle, the precise timings, the detailed routes remained locked behind a forest of letters. Convoys died in that forest. In February 1941, 7 British merchant ships had been torpedoed within 3 weeks on the Egypt-Greece run. In March, more freighters followed, going down in black water lit by oil fires, while survivors clung to rafts and watched Italian silhouettes move away into the dark. Each disaster was recorded in the files as a loss attributable ultimately to one thing: lack of timely intelligence on enemy fleet movements. The mathematicians at Bletchley Park had broken several German Enigma keys by then. Air Force, Army, administrative networks, their progress looked impressive in reports sent to Whitehall. But the Italian naval system had shrugged off every conventional attack. The variant used by the Regia Marina added complexity, changed procedures, and above all was operated with a level of discipline that erased most of the exploitable mistakes. Somewhere deep in the organization, an order went out. Italian naval Enigma was not a priority. Resources were to shift to German traffic. The Mediterranean would have to be managed with what little could be gleaned from low-grade Italian hand ciphers and aerial reconnaissance. On paper, it sounded like a strategic decision. At sea, it meant more men would die without warning. There was, however, one place inside Bletchley where orders from above were treated more as complicated suggestions: the cottage. Dilly Knox's section was a world apart from the carefully diagrammed flowcharts of Hut 6. The room stank of pipe smoke and damp wool, its tables buried under drifts of cipher sheets, rough alphabets, and tea-stained notebooks. The heating worked when it felt like it. The roof leaked, the windows did not quite shut. For the war effort, it was one of the most valuable rooms in Britain. Knox had been breaking codes since the previous war. He was a classicist by training, but at Bletchley his specialty was something very specific: getting inside the heads of enemy operators. To him, an Enigma key was not just a rotor setting. It was the sum of human habits and shortcuts that crept in around the machine. He had asked for young linguists rather than mathematicians. Women mostly. Many of them were given navy blue wren greatcoats to mark them out as part of the naval intelligence machine, even when their payroll lines technically flowed elsewhere. As far as the outside world was concerned, they were just another cluster of anonymous wrens in an anonymous country house. Inside the cottage, their work was anything but anonymous. Italian naval traffic had become Knox's private obsession. Even after official priority lists told him to stop wasting time, he kept a drawer in the cottage full of Italian intercepts. On good days, his team dipped into it like gamblers returning to a long-running game. On bad days, they worked those sheets with the quiet desperation of people who suspected that somewhere out there ships were dying because they had not yet seen the trick. That was the problem Mavis walked into when she arrived at Bletchley in 1940. Before she ever touched an Enigma slip, her life had revolved around a different kind of pattern. She had grown up in a London suburb where evenings meant newspapers spread over the kitchen table, her father circling football scores while she devoured the crossword. Word games made sense to her in a way arithmetic never quite did. Letters fell into place. Anagrams uncrossed themselves. Hidden structures revealed themselves if she stared long enough. At University College London, she chose German not because of any strategic calculation, but because the patterns of that language, its compound words, its precise grammar, felt like a familiar game written in a new alphabet. She immersed herself in romantic poetry, tracing recurring images and turns of phrase until entire stanzas seemed to glow with symmetry. When war came, she tried to volunteer as a nurse. Somebody, somewhere in the bureaucracy, looked at her language skills and redirected the application. Instead of bandages, she was given a magnifying glass and a pile of back issues of The Times. Her first wartime job for MI6 was to skim the personal columns for signs of coded communications, odd repetitions, unnatural phrasing, patterns where there should only be lonely hearts and birthday notices. It was tedious work, but it honed something inside her. The habit of asking why someone had written the same odd phrase twice, the instinct that repetition in the wrong place was never really random. In May 1940, she was summoned to Bletchley Park and walked up the drive of a Victorian mansion that looked like an eccentric businessman's house rather than the nerve centre of an intelligence war. There she found Knox, the cottage, and the unbroken mass of Italian naval traffic. Her mathematical training was basic, her knowledge of cryptographic theory almost non-existent. Knox cared about neither. What interested him was the way her eyes tracked across lines of text and the way her pencil moved of its own accord as she tested possibilities. The work was nothing like the heroic fantasies propaganda posters promised. It was repetition layered on repetition, counting letter frequencies by hand, sliding cardboard rods across alphabet strips to look for plausible fits, memorizing the stilted formalities of Italian military prose. Her colleagues learned to think in terms of rotors, turnovers, and plugboards. Mavis gravitated instead towards the human patterns behind the traffic. Which operators overused certain form phrases, which offices padded short signals with the same filler words, which admirals preferred certain stock sentences when issuing orders. It was small-scale, almost trivial knowledge, but in a system like Enigma, where the machine itself refused to give an inch, weakness could only creep in through human habit. That was the thread her whole contribution would eventually hang on. The breakthrough was born from something every codebreaker secretly relied on, but few wrote down: operator laziness. Italian naval messages followed a rigid format: call signs, salutation, content, signature. To prevent traffic analysis from revealing which messages were short and which were long, operators were instructed to pad shorter texts with meaningless words, filler phrases that made every signal look roughly the same length. The filler was supposed to vary. In practice, busy operators reached for the same handful of neutral words over and over: per, supermarina, personnel, sometimes with an extra letter in place of a space: perks, supermarinax. The cottage team knew this. They had built entire crib lists of likely Italian words that might appear in given positions. They had used them to attack commercial Enigma traffic before the war. But the version used by the Regia Marina in 1940-41 had new wiring and a new rotor, and the old tricks no longer fit neatly. The standard method for testing a crib against an Enigma message was called rodding. On long sheets of card printed with alphabets, the codebreaker would write the candidate plain text, then slide it along the cipher text, looking for alignments that obeyed Enigma's mechanical rules. It was careful, methodical work. It was not supposed to be improvised. The safe rule was simple: test a small segment of the crib, 4 letters perhaps. If it produced contradictions, move on. If it did not, pass the result to someone else to develop via machine. Mavis did not particularly like safe rules. The signal on her desk that morning in March contained the repeated 6-letter group that should not have existed. It sat there twice, in the middle of the message, like matching knots in a rope. Her mind, trained on the Times personals and the habits of anonymous Italian radio men, offered a hypothesis. Same cipher group, same underlying padding word. The most likely culprit in her crib lists was a word every Italian message seemed to lean on when the clerk was tired or uninspired: perks, per, with an X marking the space. If those 6 groups marked 2 different instances of the same filler word, typed at different moments as the rotors stepped, then each instance was a tiny equation linking plain text and cipher text under a slightly different machine state. Any given instance might be useless. Two together formed a pair of simultaneous equations. The official doctrine would have pushed that thought towards the bombs, the electromechanical devices in other huts that chewed through combinations by the thousand. Mavis did something different. She built the machine in pencil. On a long sheet of paper, she wrote out the alphabet in rows, one for each rotor position. She noted the cipher groups, then wrote underneath her best guess at the matching plaintext word. She tracked how the rotors would have advanced between the first occurrence and the second. Then, instead of stopping once she had tested the safe four-letter segment, she kept sliding the crib further along the row. That extension was the insane part, at least according to the tidy rules of the manuals. It meant trusting her intuition against the accepted procedure. But where the rules expected contradiction, her pencil began to fill with a growing set of consistent mappings. The first four letters behaved, the next two did as well. When she pushed beyond the hypothetical perks, letters resolved themselves into something that looked remarkably like personale, exactly the kind of word an Italian naval staff officer would sprinkle into a formal message. In that moment, the cipher stopped being a wall of randomness and became a machine with seams. By carefully tracing which plaintext letters had to become which ciphertext letters under specific rotor steps, she began to tighten the net around the day's key. Certain rotor orders became impossible because they implied mappings Enigma could never produce. Others survived further testing until only one arrangement of rotors, rings, and plugboard wirings could account for both occurrences of the repeated group. When she finished, her scrap of paper held something nobody else in Britain had: a working reconstruction of the Italian naval Enigma key for that day's traffic. In a place built on hierarchy, it was the sort of derivation that should have gone up the chain gently, decorously, bound in caveats. Instead, it raced. Within hours, machines in other huts were grinding through that candidate key. Messages that had been pure gibberish the day before began to resolve into Italian orders, situation reports, and deployment instructions. Among them was the signal that historians now treat as the starting gun for Cape Matapan, a deceptively bland message from Supermarina about an operation timed for the day -3 from 25 March, involving a battle fleet sortie into the eastern Mediterranean. For the first time, British naval intelligence could read, word for word, what the Italian commander, Admiral Angelo Iachino, intended to do. Mavis's pencil and paper stunt had become a key in the literal sense, and like all good keys in war, its value would be measured not in elegance but in lives. The first real test of that key did not happen on paper. It happened on black water, under a moon, with big guns trained outboard and crews watching the horizon for shapes that could kill them. The decrypted Italian traffic, once checked and rechecked by exhausted Italian linguists in other huts, went up the chain at an unusual speed. It did not feed into a general appreciation to be digested by committees. Instead, it was routed almost directly to the office of Admiral Cunningham, Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet in Alexandria. From the decrypted orders, Cunningham's staff could draw a remarkably precise picture. Iachino would take the battleship Vittorio Veneto, 6 heavy cruisers, light cruisers, and destroyers out into the eastern Mediterranean to pounce on British troop convoys supporting Greece. The Italians believed British forces were dispersed and blind. They counted on surprise. Ultra, the name that would later be given to this kind of decrypted intelligence, promised something different, the chance to turn the ambush inside out. Cunningham had his own problems. His battleships, Warspite, Valiant, Barham, were powerful but aging, with crews that had been at sea in hard conditions for months. His only carrier, HMS Formidable, carried Swordfish and Albacore torpedo bombers that were slow even by 1941 standards. His cruisers and destroyers were worn from constant convoy work. To accept the opportunity Ultra handed him, he would have to take that battered fleet to sea into an area where the Luftwaffe could strike by day and Italian guns by night, based on the word of people he had never met in a country house he had never visited. He did it anyway. The Mediterranean fleet sailed from Alexandria under strict radio silence. Publicly, Cunningham was last seen in civilian clothes at a social function so that no one ashore would notice him slipping away. To the Italians, British movements looked routine. Reconnaissance spotted ships where they expected to see them. Nothing suggested that a trap was closing. Back at Bletchley, the cottage girls watched the traffic change tone. Reports from Italian reconnaissance aircraft shifted. Ships acknowledged new orders. Supermarina sent out route adjustments that only made sense to people who could read the underlying plan. Mavis worked through the night shifts, pencil still moving, feeding fresh decrypts into the chain, even as the fleet steamed north. Whatever glamour people later attached to the moment, her reality was the same as always. Cramped desk, lumpy chair, eyes burning from lack of sleep, hands stained with graphite. She knew in the abstract that Admiral Cunningham was now inside the pattern she had helped reveal. She knew vaguely that an Italian flagship named Vittorio Veneto was somewhere in the same sea as Warspite, Valiant and Barham. But her primary focus was brutally simple. Keep the traffic flowing, keep the key updated, stay ahead of whatever changes the enemy might make under pressure. Off the island of Gavdos on 28th of March, the two fleets brushed against each other in the first phase of the battle. Italian cruisers, spotting a British cruiser force under Rear Admiral Pridham Whipple, opened fire at long range through the haze. Shell splashes climbed into the air around British masts as the Italian gunners fought their rangefinders and the British captains manoeuvred to avoid being bracketed. War in the Mediterranean had often looked like that, formal gunnery duels at daylight, both sides cautious of torpedoes and aircraft. Cape Matapan was about to look different. Formidable slow biplane torpedo aircraft went in against Vittorio Veneto in a series of attacks over the course of the day. Against all odds, one torpedo found its mark, jarring the Italian battleship and reducing her speed. For a brief window, she was vulnerable. The Italian admiral's priority became getting his main capital ship home. By late afternoon, the battle might have ended there. A damaged Italian battleship limping away, British cruisers battered but afloat, both sides claiming something that could be spun as success. Then one last torpedo attack hit the heavy cruiser Polar, knocking out her propulsion and leaving her dead in the water. From Rome's perspective, this was a complication. From Cunningham's, it was an opportunity. Supermarina ordered a support group back to aid the crippled Polar. Her sisters Zara and Fiume, plus a screen of destroyers. In pre-radar doctrine, that seemed a reasonable risk. Night action between heavy units was not part of Italian tactical thinking. Their big ships carried no radar sets to warn them of approaching enemies. Their doctrines assumed daylight gunnery, not close-range brawls in the dark. Cunningham, reading their intentions through ultra and watching their movements on radar screens aboard his own ships, shaped his fleet for something the Regia Marina did not expect: a night battle line. Engagement at point-blank range. The Mediterranean fleet's battleships closed on the Italian group in blackout conditions, their crews tense and quiet, their great turrets trained to starboard. On the bridges, officers watched the new radar sets paint echoes where the charts said only open water should be. At around 22:20, lookouts on the Italian cruisers saw shapes in the darkness. In the confusion, some believed they were friendly ships. Identification signals were not properly challenged. There was no mental script for what it meant when 3 enemy battleships, each bristling with 15-inch guns, crept within less than 2 nautical miles before opening fire. When Warspite, Valiant and Barham unleashed their salvos, the effect was closer to execution than battle. The first broadsides tore into Fiume and Zara at ranges where the dispersion pattern of battleship shells, a matter of thousands of yards at long range, collapsed into something savage and concentrated. Witnesses later spoke of seeing entire turrets lifted bodily into the air. Within minutes, both heavy cruisers were burning wrecks, their upper works shredded, their crews dying in heaps on flaming decks. Two destroyers, Vittorio Alfieri and Giosui Carducci, were caught in the same hail of fire and sank almost as quickly. The remaining escorts fled into the darkness under smoke, firing torpedoes in blind retaliation. Polar, still powerless, was found and boarded by British destroyer crews in the small hours. Survivors, dazed and shivering, were taken off before British torpedoes finished the hulk just before dawn. When the guns finally fell silent and the scattered rescue efforts ended, the butcher's bill for that single night was clear. 3 Italian heavy cruisers, Zara, Fiume, Polar, were gone. 2 destroyers lay on the seabed with them. Approximately 303 Italian sailors were dead or missing, most of them killed so fast they never knew what had betrayed them. The Royal Navy, by contrast, counted 3 dead, the crew of a single torpedo bomber shot down during the daytime attacks. On the chart, it looked like a clean tactical masterpiece. Radar, aggressive doctrine, air attacks, and gunnery perfectly combined. But behind the plot lines and engagement reports was something less visible and far more fragile. A chain of reasoning that had begun with a bored Italian operator reaching for the same filler word twice, and a 19-year-old codebreaker deciding that the rules governing rodding were suggestions, not commandments. The first real test of her insane pencil trick had not been a single decrypt. It had been whether Admiralty and fleet commanders would trust intelligence that came from an approach no manual had prescribed. The flashes over Cape Matapan answered that question in orange and white. The impact inside Bletchley was different in tone, but no less profound. News of the victory came back in fragments, a laconic signal from the Mediterranean, with casualty figures attached. A congratulatory phone call from naval intelligence to Dilly Knox, relayed through layers of switchboard operators and duty officers. A sense, strong enough to seep even into the cottage, that something decisive had happened and that the obscure staff work done in that leaky building had mattered more than anyone had expected. For Mavis, the immediate consequence was simple: no rest. Keys that yielded once could be made to yield again. The recognition that Italian naval Enigma was not, in fact, invulnerable re-weighted the priorities. What had been a semi-clandestine cottage project became an officially sanctioned line of attack. Traffic volumes increased, expectations did as well. The insane rodding extension she had improvised on that March morning hardened into a method. Others in Knox's team learned to look for repeated padding groups, to treat filler words as leverage rather than noise. Crib lists were updated, not just with obvious operational terms, but with the personal habits of individual operators, who overused supermarina, who liked personnel, who fell back on formulaic sign-offs. It was not a mathematical revolution, it was a cultural one. Instead of modelling Enigma as an abstract permutation machine, the cottage increasingly treated it as what it actually was in the field, a machine driven by hurried, fallible humans. As more days' keys were broken, the returns multiplied. Italian fleet movements that would once have appeared only as vague clusters of direction-finding bearings now unfolded in full sentences. Plans for convoy attacks, resupply operations, and mine-laying sorties were read before the ships left harbour. Sometimes that intelligence allowed Cunningham to repeat the Matapan pattern, laying ambushes for Italian surface units when they ventured east. More often, it allowed British convoys to reroute entirely, avoiding danger zones that the enemy thought were secret. By mid-1941, the cumulative effect was visible in the balance of shipping losses. While British forces still suffered heavily in the Mediterranean, the worst disasters increasingly came from air attack or German U-boats, not from Italian battle fleets blundering into convoys unannounced. When the Regia Marina did sortie in strength, it often found itself shadowed by aircraft and harassed by forces that seemed preternaturally well placed. Officially, this was credited to reconnaissance and good luck. In reality, it was the cottage and its methods at work. Inside Bletchley, Italian naval traffic became a sort of training ground for exploiting human error in machine systems. The same mindset eventually carried over when the cottage turned its attention to German Abwehr Enigma machines, variants that many had considered unbreakable. When Mavis later spotted a dummy message that contained every letter of the alphabet except one, clear evidence that an operator had simply held down a single key on his machine, she recognized the pattern instantly. The trick of using a lazy gesture as a wedge had already proved itself at Matapan. What had started as one girl's willingness to keep pushing a crib beyond the sanctioned limit had evolved into a general doctrine. Anywhere there was a machine, there would be people cutting corners, and in those corners lay the cracks. No manual had told her that. War experience had. Her life after 1941 did not return to anything that could be called ordinary, but it did fall into a rhythm that left little room for reflection. Through the rest of the war, she stayed in Knox's orbit, working not only Italian but also German traffic. The breakthroughs on the Abwehr networks, achieved with the same blend of linguistic instinct and operator psychology, allowed British intelligence to read enemy assessments of Allied deception plans, including those that shaped the run-up to D-Day. The leverage she had pioneered against one naval Enigma system now rippled across entire campaigns. Knox himself died in 1943, worn out by illness and years of sustained effort. By then, he had made clear who he trusted to carry on his methods. Mavis, still in her early 20s, found herself among the small group of analysts he personally nominated to continue the cottage's work. When the war ended, Bletchley Park folded in on itself. Code-breaking operations were wound down, restructured, or moved. The Official Secrets Act wrapped everything she had done in a layer of silence so dense it might as well have been concrete. She could not tell her parents how she had spent her 20s. She could not tell her husband, in peacetime postings in the diplomatic service, the details of what they had done together at Bletchley. Job applications mentioned only war work. The world moved on, and so did she. In the decades that followed, she reinvented herself as a garden historian, cataloguing and campaigning for the preservation of historic landscapes with the same thoroughness she had once applied to Cipher tables. Awards came for that work, medals, honours, recognition from societies that cared about roses and parterres rather than rotors and plugboards. The story of Cape Matapan, when it finally emerged into public view after declassification in the 1970s, did so in a familiar pattern. The emphasis fell on admirals and battleships, on radar and torpedoes. Code-breaking appeared as a crucial but faceless force, a kind of narrative weather. Names like Turing rightfully took their place in the public imagination. Mavis's role was harder to compress into a headline. It involved no iconic machine she had personally designed, no single moment of cinematic revelation. It was a matter of pencil marks on cheap paper at an unglamorous desk, of noticing that a padding group appeared twice where it should not, of being willing to lean into that anomaly with enough stubbornness to drag out a key. Historians, trawling through declassified documents, eventually reconstructed the chain. Reports noted that the naval success at Cape Matapan owed much to decrypts produced in Knox's research section, based on an early break into Italian naval Enigma led by his assistants. Some articles began to mention a particular assistant by name. Books on Bletchley gave her a chapter. Obituaries, when they came, hailed her as one of the most effective female codebreakers of the war and singled out her role in the Matapan intelligence for special mention. By then, decades had passed since the night Italian cruisers blew apart under British salvos south of Greece. The Italian sailors who had died there never knew that their navy's reliance on a meticulously designed cipher machine had been undermined by something as mundane as a reused filler word. The officers who wrote Supermarina's orders never heard the pencil scratching in a damp English cottage that turned their secret timetable into British foreknowledge. For Mavis, the work remained, to the end, something she did because it needed doing. The fact that it had shattered 5 Italian warships in a single night was not, in her mind, material for self-congratulation. It was simply the logical consequence of an intelligence race she had been placed in and had refused to lose. The Mediterranean campaign would grind on. Other battles would be won or lost for reasons that had nothing to do with her. But one fact, once obscure and now well documented, sits like a pin in any map of that war. On a March morning in 1941, a young woman at Bletchley Park turned an insane pencil and paper insight into a working key for Italian naval Enigma. 3 days later, off Cape Matapan, that key turned into burning steel, shattered hulls, and 2,303 Italian sailors dead in the dark, while 3 British airmen paid the price for the other side. Most people never learned her name, but you do now.